This townhome sold for $447,000 in 2006. 3 years later, after the housing crash, it sold for $307,000. Today, it's listed for almost double that 2009 purchase price. During that time, Loudoun County became home to the largest concentration in data centers in the world. So, depending on who you talk to, these buildings are either destroying communities or they are one of the best things that ever happened to Loudoun County. But if you're actually buying a house here, neither one of those answers is good enough. Because while this house is gaining value, Loudoun was also changing the rules governing what could be built around homes like this one. And some projects already in the pipeline can still move forward without the approval process required today. So let's take a look at what actually changed. When this townhome sold in 2009, data centers weren't new to Loudoun. The infrastructure that eventually created Data Center Alley was already there. But the scale we see today was still coming. Loudoun had a reason to want it: taxes. The county had been heavily dependent on residential real estate for revenue and wanted to diversify its tax base. The data centers turned out to be an extraordinary good thing for doing that. Today, Loudoun County's data centers generate almost half the county's property tax revenue. And here's the number that explains why local governments love these things. For every $1 in county services Loudoun provides to data centers, the county says it receives approximately $26 in tax revenue. $26 for every dollar in services. That's because a data center is very different from a neighborhood. It can contain an enormous amount of taxable real estate and computer equipment without creating the same demand for schools and many other residential services. Financially, it's an incredible deal for the county, but there's the other side of that deal. Where do you put them? In 2014, Loudoun actually treated data centers as office use for zoning purposes. Then, the county created a separate definition for data centers. But under the old zoning ordinance, it was still permitted by right in 5 zoning districts. And that phrase, by right, matters if you're buying a house. Because if a property was properly zoned and the project met the applicable requirements, the data center didn't necessarily need the kind of individual legislative approval it generally needs today. So imagine you're buying this townhome years ago. There's an empty parcel nearby. Maybe it's industrial, maybe it's commercial. You drive past and think, there's nothing there. That's not the real question. The question is, what does zoning allow someone to put there? And eventually, Virginia started seeing conflicts between these industrial facilities and residential neighborhoods. A statewide study by Virginia's Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission found approximately 1/3 of Virginia's data centers were located near residential areas. JLARC concluded that the industrial scale of these facilities makes them largely incompatible with residential uses and found inadequate local planning and zoning contributed to some of those conflicts. Now, here's where the discussion usually gets emotional, because that does not mean everybody living near a data center is miserable. JLARC found most data centers don't generate noise complaints, but when there's conflict, the homeowner may be dealing with something very real: mechanical noise, generator testing, massive building, substations, transmission infrastructure, or simply an industrial use next to a residential community. So Loudoun started changing the rules. In 2023, Loudoun adopted a new zoning ordinance, and the standard around residential properties got substantially stronger. Data centers adjacent to residential property became subject to expanded requirements involving setbacks, soundproofing of mechanical equipment, noise studies, generator testing hours, equipment screening, and landscaping and buffers. In typical situations, we're talking about a 200-foot building setback from residential property. A parking can be required to sit 100 feet back, and generator testing next to residential property is generally limited to weekdays during specific daytime hours outside commissioning and emergency operations. And those aren't the standards a buyer was evaluating. Those aren't the standards a buyer was evaluating when this townhome sold in 2009. The rules governing how a data center could interact with nearby residential property have changed substantially since then. And that's important because Loudoun was putting more distance and more protection between industrial facilities and somebody's home. But it still hasn't addressed one of the biggest issues, the approval process itself. That changed in 2025. And March 18th, 2025, Loudoun changed the rules. Data centers became conditional use under the county's comprehensive plan. And in the industrial park, general industry, and mineral resources, heavy industrial zoning districts, new data centers uses now require special exceptions. That's a major difference because zoning allows this use by right to this particular data center use needs legislative approval. That creates public review and gives the board of supervisors the opportunity to evaluate the application. So if you're buying a home in Loudoun County today, you have more land use protections than the person buying this townhome had years ago, except there is a catch. Some projects were grandfathered. When Loudoun changed the rules, the board adopted a grandfather resolution. Certain data centers applications before February 12th, 2025 may continue through the previous pathway without obtaining the new special exception approval for data center use. Think about what that means as a buyer. You could research zoning today. You could understand the 2025 rules, and there still could be a project already moving through the system under early approval pathway. That's why looking at today's zoning isn't enough. You need to know what's already been filed. No, but the data center building isn't necessarily the only thing I would investigate. I'd look at the electricity infrastructure because these facilities require an enormous amount of power. That can mean substations, transmission corridors, new high voltage lines. And this is where our townhome example matters again. A buyer could do everything right. Look at the house, drive past the nearby data centers, check the surrounding land, and still overlook the electrical infrastructure that could serve this kind of a development. And here's something a lot of homeowners probably don't realize. Loudoun County doesn't have final authority where high voltage transmission lines go. The county can participate. It can advocate for particular routes. It can adopt policies where it would prefer transmission infrastructure to be located, but the regulatory authority approving those projects belongs to the Virginia State Corporations Commission. This isn't theoretical. Loudoun County has multiple active and approved transmission projects tied to growing electrical demand. The county even adopted electrical infrastructure map in 2026 to help guide where it wants future transmission lines, where it wants future transmission corridors located. But Loudoun itself says it has no formal authority in transmission line approval process. That's a completely separate thing I want to understand before buying a house, because you could spend all your time researching the data center and miss the infrastructure required to power it. Now, here's where I think both sides of this argument need to pay attention. If you hate data centers, you can't ignore what they've done for the Loudoun's tax base. And if you love data centers because of tax revenue, you can't ignore the land use infrastructure use issues that caused Loudoun to tighten the rules. Both things can be true. Let's look at the money. Computer equipment inside Loudoun data centers is currently taxed at $4.15 for every $100 of assessed value. Data center revenue can grow. Data center revenue now accounts for 38% of Loudoun's general fund revenue. And Loudoun's residential property tax has fallen from $1.14.5 per $100 in 2016 to 80.5 cents in 2026. Don't confuse tax rate with tax bill. Your home assessments can rise enough that your actual bill still goes up. In that fact, Loudoun says the average homeowner's real estate tax bill is expected to increase in 2026 because of rising assessments. But the county has something remarkable. Without the data center industry, Loudoun estimates its real estate property tax would likely be above $1 per $100 instead of 80.5 cents. So if you're a homeowner who can't stand looking at data centers, you're also living in a county receiving an enormous amount of tax revenue from them. And if you're somebody saying, great, build as many as possible, remember why Loudoun changed the rules in the first place. because location matters. And that brings me back to this townhome. It sold for $307,000 in 2009. Today, it's listed for almost double that. So did the explosion of data centers make this property more valuable? I can't tell you that, and neither can someone simply point at the data center and tell you it destroyed the value. One house doesn't prove either argument, but we do have broader Northern Virginia research. George Mason University's Centers for Regional Analysis examined home sales and proximity to data centers, and what they found is probably going to irritate somebody watching the videos. Homes closer to data centers actually tend to sell for more, not less. And the relationship showed up among single-family homes, townhomes, and condos. Now, before the data center supporters claim victory, that does not prove the data centers caused the higher price. The researchers point out an obvious complications. Data centers tend to be located around valuable roads, utilities, employment centers, and airports. The same thing that makes residential real estate valuable. Though correlation, not necessary causation. But it does mean I have found credible evidence supporting a blanket statement that simply being closer to a data center automatically destroys your property value. And that's why, as a buyer, I would stop arguing about data centers in general and start investigating my specific property. So let's come back to this townhome one last time. If I was buying it today, I wouldn't ask my agent, are there data centers around here? That's too broad. I'd ask, what's around this property today? How are surrounding parcels zoned? What can legally be built here? Are there pending data center applications? Could any of these applications fall under Loudoun County's grandfather's rules? Then I look beyond the buildings. Where are the substations? Where are the transmission corridors? Are there active SCC applications affecting this area? And if the data center is close enough that I'm concerned about it, I'm going there. I'm driving around the neighborhood. I'm looking at the actual buffer. I'm looking what's between the house and the facility, and I'm listening, because a line on Google Maps isn't going to tell you what living there felt like. This townhome was here before much of Loudoun's data center expansion. Since then, its value has increased substantially. Loudoun's tax base has changed dramatically. The county strengthened its residential protections. It eliminated the right data center development in several major industrial districts. It created a special exemption process, and Virginia added additional review requirements for some of the largest facilities. And the rules are still evolving. Loudoun is currently working through phase 2 of its data center standards, with additional changing involving compatibility, substations, noise, building height, onset power generation, and other issues under consideration. I'm not going to tell you don't buy near a data center. I'm not going to tell you data centers don't matter. I'm going to tell you something much more useful. Know what you're buying, not just the house, the land around it, the infrastructure around it, and the rules governing what can come next.